Funding for Market Journal is provided by the Nebraska Soybean Board.
Soybeans are found on dinner tables around the world. Some form of the soybean is found in baby foods, snacks, cooking oils, and many other food items eaten daily. And soybeans provide the protein in the diets for livestock and fish. The Nebraska soybean farmers support research to develop new soy-based products for foods, livestock, and industrial uses through their checkoff dollars. The Nebraska Soybean Checkoff, growing opportunity from the ground up.
Market Journal, television for agricultural business decisions, is a presentation of the University of Nebraska-Lincoln's Institute of Agriculture and Natural Resources. Promotional support is provided by the Nebraska Farmer Magazine, and major funding for Market Journal is provided by the Nebraska Soybean Board. The Soybean Checkoff, growing opportunity from the ground up.
Welcome to this week's edition of Market Journal. I'm Jeff Wilkerson. On this episode, Frayne Olson examines possible acreage plantings for 2015. Tamra Jackson-Ziems explains why now is a valuable time to control corn diseases. David Kohl analyzes the current state of agriculture. And Brian Krenke explains how unmanned aerial vehicles could be used on ag operations. Frayne Olson from North Dakota State is our marketing analyst this week. In 2014, U.S. farmers planted 90.9 million acres of corn, 84.2 million acres of soybeans, and 56.8 million acres of wheat. If long-term USDA projections are realized, growers will plant fewer acres to each of those three commodities for at least the next 10 years. We recently talked with Frayne about his thoughts on spring acres for 2015 and began by asking if the analysis was more or less complex with lower commodity prices.
You know, that's a great question, they're both really difficult because it's what you're really trying to do is anticipate in aggregate what farmers are going to do, and it changes so much from one region of the U.S. to the other region. And so, you know, we've been spending a lot of time as corn prices and soybeans prices have come up. We're looking for more acres. Where are they going to come from? And obviously with the retracement now, the last several months in both corn and bean prices, everybody's looking at saying, well, where's the cutback going to be? How are farmers going to reallocate or switch acres around?
As you pencil it out, is there a lot that's coming back positive?
You know, most crops are break even at best, and in some cases you're losing money, again, depending upon where you are in the country. At least in the northern plains, the region I'm most familiar with, soybeans seem to be the one that pencils out a little bit easier. But for the other major crops we grow in the region, corn and wheat, you know, you got to be a bit careful. If you can trim some expenses off and hopefully have a good production year, you can still make it pencil, but it's much harder this year.
So what are your expectations about what we could see come spring in terms of which acres will get planted?
Yeah, and of course that's an open debate. I know that there are a couple analysts, private analysts, that are putting some numbers out now. USDA recently came out with some long-term forecasts that they are also trying to get a signal to farmers on what might happen next year. We also have the University of Missouri, the Food and Agricultural Policy Research Institute, FAPRI, also puts together some long-term forecasts that I follow fairly closely. And all of those are looking for a cutback in corn acres, anywhere from 2 to 3 million acre cutback in corn acres, an increase in soybean, anywhere from a slight increase to about 2 million acre increase in soybeans, depending upon which analyst you look at. And wheat acres to remain about steady, about constant. My expectation, based on what I see up here, is I do think, at least in the northern plains, we're going to have more spring wheat acres.
Because?
Well, mainly because North Dakota and western Minnesota, western South Dakota, parts of Minnesota, northwest Minnesota, we're the transition zone for corn. So as corn prices have gone up and the world is signaling somebody needs to produce more corn, these guys have stepped forward and started raising more corn acres. Now, as prices have fallen and basically world markets are saying we don't need that many acres, this will more than likely be the area that we cut back the quickest. So again, we're the transition zone. As prices fall, we tend to drop our acreage and switch to something else because we do have a lot of different crops we raise up here.
Well, with that said, and you mentioned before that it might be break even at best at some of these commodities, is it chasing people to alfalfa or to CRP or to some sort of alternative crop?
Yeah, and I'll speak to the Northern Plains first. What we're seeing is a lot more interest in some of what I call the smaller market crops or specialty crops. Again, we raise a wide variety of those up here, and so we can get some shifting acres around that way. Also with, in particular, the higher beef prices and a recovery now in the profitability of dairy, there are some guys that are looking at an increased alfalfa acreage as a roughage source, a feed source for animal agriculture, which is important too. So we are seeing some of those acres shift around, and I think getting rejumbled as we move forward.
You've been traveling the state talking about prices and the outlook. As you go forward and you see that it is a tight margin, what things could throw a wrench into that?
Well, what I've been trying to explain is that even though right now it looks like we have plenty of surplus, if you look at the world standings, at world stocks to use ratio, we're comfortable. We haven't rebuilt them to a level where they're burdensome. And so I'm trying to remind farmers that, essentially we are as a world one crop failure away from much higher prices. And obviously the first one on deck for that, the first one we're looking at right now is South America. And the South American production obviously is critical for soybeans and soybean prices, but it's also really important for corn because both Argentina and Brazil the last couple of years have been major export competitors for us. So that's one region I think we have to look at very, very closely.
January 12th, we get a slew of reports. WASDE, crop production, the final numbers from this last harvest, grain stocks, and then winter wheat seedings. What are you going to be looking at in these numbers? Frayne, anything specific?
Well, obviously there's going to be a lot of information in all of them. The first thing I'll be looking for is, are they going to adjust any of the harvested acreage numbers for corn and soybeans? There's discussions that might happen. We're also going to be looking for any kind of changes in world demand. Our USDA forecasts for exports, have they been moving up or are we seeing some adjustments on that front?
Next week, Roy Smith will join us to analyze corn and soybean markets ahead of the USDA's January crop report. And University of Missouri Extension economist Ron Plain will be with us to recap the agency's latest estimates on hog inventory. If you haven't yet selected your seed for this year's corn acres, our following interview with Nebraska Extension plant pathologist Tamra Jackson-Ziems could help in guarding against potential problems. We recently talked with Tamra, who said even though it's the off-season, now is a valuable time to manage corn diseases.
Well, selecting the right seed corn hybrid can actually help you minimize or avoid disease altogether next year, but it requires you knowing your field history and what diseases you've had problems with last year and in previous years.
Why is that so important to know what each field has had in the past?
Well, it's really important to us because many of the most important pathogens, like the ones that cause Goss's wilt, gray leaf spot, and northern corn leaf blight, have pathogens that overwinter either in residue or in the soil. And so if you've had them in the past, there's a really good chance that you're going to see them again, whether it's this year or in the coming years.
Do some diseases cause so many problems that it may push you to rotation of a different crop the following year?
Absolutely. There are many tools available to us depending on which disease that you're struggling with. And crop rotation is also very important to us, and especially so for certain diseases.
Which diseases across the state were prevalent this growing season?
Well, this past year, as everyone knows, we had a pretty violent weather year, and so we had a lot of wounding in the corn crop all the way across the state. And one of our most important diseases in Nebraska and now in the Midwest is Goss's bacterial wilt and blight. The pathogen that causes Goss's wilt can infect plants through wounds, and so we did see more Goss's wilt in some areas, although it didn't become as severe as we thought. But it's out there. In addition, in the eastern part of the state, we saw northern corn leaf blight severity that we have never seen before. And so those are two important pathogens I think we're going to see more of in the coming years.
Why are you fearful that Goss's wilt, if you've had it before, will reemerge?
Absolutely. That pathogen overwinters in infected residue extremely well, and so I would go so far as to guarantee that you're going to see it again. And the most effective way to manage Goss's wilt that we have now is with a resistant hybrid and crop rotation.
Are there other diseases like that where, if you've had it, it's difficult to get rid of it and you might see it, it might become a problem again?
There's probably a few examples. One in particular this year, I mentioned northern corn leaf blight. That's caused by a fungus. It does overwinter in our crop residue, much like gray leaf spot or Goss's wilt. And we do have resistance, and our seed companies do rate their hybrids for resistance or tolerance to northern corn leaf blight. That's a great way to control that disease. And also, it may help you delay or even avoid a fungicide application and save you on input costs.
On the CropWatch website, you can find more information about corn diseases, including video examples. We'll link to those resources on the Market Journal homepage. Another entry into the expanding field of irrigation automation has cropped up in north central Nebraska. On the January Nebraska Farmer cover, you'll learn about FieldWise, a Ewing-based company that developed a telemetry device that lets irrigators remotely monitor and control their center pivots. Ken Krunterad, pictured here, came up with the idea for the device with his son-in-law, Brian Klewinski. You can learn more about how the system works in the January Nebraska Farmer. The Fremont Corn Expo takes place Thursday at Christensen Field in Fremont. The event begins at 8 a.m. with a complimentary breakfast. We asked Nathan Mueller, this year's organizer, to describe how attending the event could benefit producers.
The Fremont Corn Expo is really for the local growers to get information from the commodity groups who are funding this, the Nebraska Corn Board, Nebraska Corn Growers Association, Farm Bureau, Fremont Chamber of Commerce, and First National Bank. And we're going to have a great lineup of speakers that will provide information for them on marketing risk, crop insurance, GMOs in our diet, precision ag and how that's can help them with profitability, and even consumption of their corn by the possible expansion of the livestock industry. Our keynote speaker is going to be Ruth McDonald. She's from Iowa State, and she's in food science and human nutrition. And she'll be talking from the consumption side. Is there a risk to GMOs in our diet? So she's really looking at our dietary factors and how that could possibly increase our chance of cancer. So she's really looking at a different perspective than you normally hear and have a really unique talk for the audience there.
The event and meals are free to attendees. We'll link to more information about speakers and topics at Thursday's Fremont Corn Expo on the Market Journal website. If you've attended enough ag events in this state, there's a good chance you've probably heard David Kohl speak. He's a professor emeritus at Virginia Tech and regularly travels Nebraska during December to talk about agriculture, the economy, and international demand. While livestock producers are now rebounding after sustained drought, crop growers are seeing shrinking margins from high input costs and lower commodity prices. International buyers are, however, in line for what this country produces. The USDA says ag exports reached a new record of more than $152 billion for the 2014 fiscal year, an increase of nearly $12 billion from the previous record set the year before. During our conversation with David at the Embassy Suites in mid-December, we talked about the countries to watch in 2015, why debt concentration is a concern to the industry, and if there are any parallels to be drawn from hard agricultural times during the 1980s.
It was real interesting. We just had the National Agriculture Bankers Convention over in Omaha. Actually, we had 757 bankers out, largest conference, and there was a lot of talk about the 1980s. And you know, it's real interesting. There are some similarities. In other words, it was real interesting. The grain industry in the 70s got hot first, and then the livestock industry, and then of course we had higher interest rates and then the crash. But it's a little bit different this time, because one of the things that we found, instead of producers borrowing money to buy land, they've got more cash or equity invested. So when we see the correction, it'll probably be a lot slower. But the other element that's kind of spooky, debt was dispersed during the 1970s and 1980s over a large number of farms and ranches. Today, it's very concentrated. Of the 2.1 million farms, 270,000 generate 80% of the production, but they carry 60% of the debt. So it's a debt concentration issue. So we're going to have to watch that very closely.
Why is that such a big deal?
Because what happens is we're dealing with bigger numbers. And so when one of the larger farms and ranches goes upside down, it could have a dramatic impact on an ag lender's portfolio.
What things have come together to put an end to the good times in the grain industry?
We have been in the great commodity supercycle. And let's put it in context. Since 1910, there's only been 4. This one lasted a full decade. The others lasted 2 to 4 years. But what's happened is we've seen a slowdown of the emerging nations like China, like Brazil. Those economies have slowed down in growth. The second thing is we've seen kind of a slowdown of ethanol and biofuels. In other words, the ethanol mandate is kind of run its course. But the third element is the possibility of increasing interest rates and the possible strengthening of the dollar, which inhibits our exports. All those three, combined with our good friend Mother Nature, and Mother Nature has blessed us with good growing degree days and water, not only here in the northern hemisphere, but the southern hemisphere. Well, all 4 of those have kind of come together to, kind of suppress the prices. The big question is, how much longer is it going to last? We could see a 1 to 3 year downturn, or we could see a reset of prices from 2001 to 2007 if these 4 conditions persist.
Is it a given that interest rates will change significantly in this next year?
I think one of the things that you have to view is 3 things. Number one, if unemployment continues in the high 5 range, 5%, 5.5%, that's a check that interest rates would increase. The second thing that we've got to watch for is the continued growth of the U.S. economy. It's clicking along at about a 3.9% growth rate. That stays above 3%. That's another click that we'd see interest rates increase. But the real one to watch for is inflation rate. It's currently about 1.7, 1.8% rate. If that happens to go up about 2.5%, that would be the kind of the canary in the coal mine that says we would see interest rates increase in mid-2015. Now, my bets, we'll see an increase in interest rates mid-2015 if the economy continues to grow, people's wage growth increases, and then eventually inflation increases.
You talked about China and Brazil. What other things do you see overseas that could impact U.S. ag exports?
Boy, really keep a close eye on Europe. Europe's going into recession. It's 25% of the world economy. Folks here in the Midland would say, why watch Europe? That's China's largest customer. And so if Europe slows down, then the Chinese economy slows down, which that inhibits the ability for them to import food, fiber, and fuel, which we produce here in the heartland. The other element we've got to watch for is China. China was growing at about a 10, 11% growth rate there for a number of years. Now that's possibly 6, 7%, and may even go down to 5 to 4%. And so if China continues to slow down, that's going to come back and impact what we call the flyover states or the heartland of America.
What about Japan? That's a country that seems to be having a lot of trouble, and they're a big buyer of a lot of U.S. ag goods.
Exactly. See, they're the 3rd largest economy in the world, and their central banker has actually done the same things that Dr. Bernanke and Dr. Yellen have with the stimulus. But you know what the big problem is in Japan? It has an aging population, much more so than the United States or other countries around the world. So what's happening to their economic business model and their economy is that it's demographics that's creating the issues, combined with they were too late with the stimulus. And so, again, the 3rd largest economy in the world. Think about it. I was at a futuristic conference in Toronto the other day. They may not even be in the top 10 by the year 2030.
We talked a year or two ago about young people returning to the farm. It was a time when they could make decent money. Does that change now that the super cycle's over?
I think there's still tremendous opportunities for youngsters to come into the farm and the ranch business or come into agribusiness. It's going to be real interesting to see if what I call my alpha pups or the millennial generation is going to be able to take a punch. And my contention is 25%, they'll be gone in a New York minute. Another 25%, they'll kind of be on the fence, but there's going to be 50% that will hunker down, and actually they'll use this as an educational experience, and they'll do very, very well.
What would you advise the producers getting ready for 2015 if they know margins are going to be tighter, some things that they can do on their operations?
Boy, I'll tell you one thing, right after the first year or here in December, they better be looking at their financial records, knowing their cost of production, And one of the things they're going to have to do is arm themselves with good financial information so that they can come out and renegotiate, with landlords or look at some of the dynamics of reducing cost. The second thing that's going to happen, particularly over on the grain side, some of them are going to have what they call a negative coverage ratio. In other words, not being able to cover their debt payments. So they're going to have to draw on financial liquidity. And so that's going to be very, very critical. But I would have to tell you, 2015 is going to be a game of chicken. In other words, do we supplement the landlord and take the losses, or do we give up, some of the assets? And I think one of the things that's going to be a key is shedding marginal assets. That's land, machinery, livestock, or in some cases, the human asset. And so it's going to be some very, very critical times. But one of the things that's going to be important is that it's a collaborative effort. They're going to have to work with a group of people in making decisions.
As it relates to margins in 2015, our interview with Ed Ussett from our previous episode discusses developing a marketing plan for the year. It can be found with the December 26th episode of Market Journal. They're not very big, but they could offer a drastically new dimension to agricultural production. Unmanned aerial vehicles could give farmers and ranchers a unique view of their fields, livestock, or operations, and on a regular basis. The problem is, as you'll hear, Federal Aviation Administration rules regulating their use are not ideal for use in ag. UNL researchers both on East Campus and at the Nimbus Lab on City Campus, Nimbus standing for Nebraska Intelligent Mobile Unmanned Systems, are working to learn more about UAVs and what they can do. At the Power Farming Show last month, we talked with Nebraska Extension soils educator Brian Krinke about the increasing popularity of these new pieces of machinery.
UAVs, they've been around, but there's just been a lot of interest building lately because there are so many different companies, there's so many different platforms being developed, and it's becoming more of a novelty at some point because they're cost effective, they're relatively inexpensive, they're stable, and they're a lot of fun. And so I think it takes that fun side and starts to make it into how can we start using this to be more productive in agriculture. And it's not a far stretch when we start looking at what we can actually do with these things.
Now, if you follow drones or unmanned aerial vehicles in their use, you know that the FAA has spent a long time looking at their use. Tell me where the regulations and laws stand right now.
Well, where they stand are basically absent of how to do this commercially, so to speak. The way we interpret the rules, or lack of, is that you can only do this as a hobby. So basically for fun. You can't fly higher than 400 feet. It's got to be within your visual range, and you have to be, I believe it's 5 miles from an airport. And that's how we interpret it. We're playing it safe. Technically speaking, you're not supposed to be selling this product, the use of it to make money.
So in the instance that eventually these would be widespread or available widespread, tell me what they could do in agriculture.
Well, whenever the regulations get hammered out, and we're kind of waiting, I think September 30th of next year is kind of that final deadline of when this is supposed to come out, we can do all sorts of things. If we were going to talk about the lowest hanging fruit, we could talk about just getting that different perspective. If you imagine yourself scouting your fields and what you can see when the corn's above your head or soybeans, you can only see so much. But the second you get above and now you start seeing that big picture start to come together, things start making a lot more sense. We can start addressing issues. You can target, you can figure out what's going on there. So that's the low-hanging fruit. Then there's a big spectrum of other things. And at the university, we've been working in the ag department on remote sensing aspects, meaning taking images, wavelengths of light that you can't see, so we'll refer to that as infrared, thermal imagery even, and using that in different combinations with computer software to give us some kind of plant status. And so nitrogen deficiency really lends itself well to this. That's just the tip of the iceberg.
Yeah, more on that. You said that you think it's very time intensive.
Yeah, it is.
Their use
Absolutely.
right now, and you think that in the future research will be done or research is being done to make them less time intensive.
Absolutely. So eventually everybody's going to have one of these things in their back pocket. I mean, they're going to be so ubiquitous that there's going to be a lot of concerns of how are these going to interact with each other. And so a lot of research, not in the ag department, but in the computer science department, is looking at how are these things going to work together, talk to each other, go out and collect data on an automated basis, so that as a producer, you don't have to sit there, twiddle your thumbs, or maybe do something more productive, but wait for a UAV to come back. Instead, making your time more valuable, doing it for you and bringing you back that actionable intelligence, if you will.
What can the cost run on something like this?
That's just all over the place, and without kind of competition in the market for a commercial standpoint, besides just buying the unit, it's already from the low hundreds to tens of thousands. And it really depends on your objective, what you're trying to do, the sensor that you're trying to carry. And so I think of it a lot like we would talk about tractors and implements. I call them flying tractors, because that's really all they are. Is they're a unit that carries something of interest to collect data. And depending on how you use it, you can see the price just go all over the place. And then we start talking about the software processing, the expertise necessary. There's going to be all sorts of pricing structures, leasing options, ownership options, service options, on and on and on. So I would never say a hard figure now, because I think it's going to just be all over the place.
Al Dutcher will be back next week with his normal weekly weather forecast. Today's interviews can be found on the Market Journal website and through the Market Journal mobile app. They include information on planted acres in 2015, corn diseases, the health of U.S. agriculture, and unmanned aerial vehicles in ag production. As always, you can keep up with Market Journal during the week by following us on Instagram, Facebook, and Twitter. Next week, Ron Plain will analyze the inventory of U.S. hogs, and Roy Smith will look at corn and soybean markets ahead of the USDA's January crop report. Until then, thanks for watching. I'm Jeff Wilkerson. We'll see you next week.
Join Market Journal online at marketjournal.unl.edu. You can also follow us on Facebook and Twitter. Promotional support is provided by the Nebraska Farmer Magazine. Funding for Market Journal is provided by the Nebraska Soybean Board. The Soybean Checkoff, growing opportunity from the ground up. Market Journal is produced by the University of Nebraska-Lincoln's Institute of Agriculture and Natural Resources. Funding for Market Journal is provided by the Nebraska Soybean Board.
Whether it's spring planting, fall harvesting, or just a drive across the state, soy biodiesel helps a diesel-powered engine operate in a demanding job. Soybean oil from Nebraska soybeans makes biodiesel a renewable fuel that's also environmentally responsible. The Soybean Checkoff plays a major role in supporting the use and availability of biodiesel. The Nebraska Soybean Board, growing opportunity from the ground up.